So today's session is about looking at gender and women's rights and how do we teach or try to integrate genders and women's rights into our teaching. I think with teaching gender and women's rights can be very empowering, for the learners. When they learned about the rights and the concepts of equalities and discrimination. When I teach this, I try to have more discussion and case studies and looking at the real examples of what's happening in different scenarios, different contexts, and see what kind of discriminations that women face and what are the ways to handle or to deal with that kind of situation. It's not just to share about knowledge or learning about a topic, but also to incorporate how do we teach on this particular topic. So I think before we can integrate gender into our human rights, broader human rights teaching, we need to understand the key concepts of gender and gender-based discrimination under CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I think that's one of the main convention or treaties, the 9 treaties, the core treaties. We should be able to analyze and identify different models of equality. Because even when we talk about equality, there are different understandings of what we mean by achieving equality or gender equality or other forms of equality for that matter. And I find also understanding concept of equality and non-discrimination from the CEDAW or from the gender perspective it's helpful in understanding the dimension of equality and discrimination when it comes to other identities, whether it's race to intersectionality, looking race, class. So these are the main identities that people get discriminated. To understand why we need to have specific treaty on women, addressing women's rights, we need to also understand the conditions that women face. In teaching human rights, we want to be active and participatory, and this is a different mode from lecturing. But maybe this is something you could think about also. How do you engage people when you do online teaching? To start with, I usually ask students to think about experiences of discrimination that students themselves or their friends, female friends or a member of the family have had. If they don't want to talk about a personal experience, they can also talk about general situation or experience they have witnessed in the society or their families or friends. So the nature of discrimination is restriction or distinction, that because you are a woman, you cannot do certain things. You cannot have access to certain places, or in terms of workplace as well. There's certain things are expected of you. You cannot do, or you should do, or you should not do. It's related to also the status, how men are perceived in the society as having not perhaps, but higher status. And so when they are asked to do something by women, it seems like that is inappropriate because men have higher status. So when we see a situation of discrimination or experience of discrimination, we want to be able to understand what is the nature of that discrimination and what were the assumptions on which this discrimination were based. Like why women aren't allowed to enter a sacred place, religious place. We need to ask the questions, why is that? What are the assumptions? why a woman do not get the inheritance. It's even in the law. What were other assumptions? When women cannot inherit, or when inheritance go to the son, is the assumption because women will not take care of the parents later? Or is it because then women do not carry on the names of the family? So we have to start asking what are the assumptions, and then what are the impacts or result of that assumption or discriminations that we see when women cannot worship or are prevented from entering certain sacred place or are not able to inherit. What happened? What are the results? And so that's also have an implication, right, on the status of women, that we remain as second sex because we cannot, we are prevented, we are restricted to certain areas, and we are not allowed to do certain things. So the status does not change if the stereotypes remained unquestioned and not questioned. So this is something we need to be able to illustrate, that there are discriminations, gender-based discrimination in the society. What are the examples that we can see in the society? Because sometimes people do not see this as being discriminatory because it's something you've been doing for a long time, and I think it's normal. It's part of the society. That's how the culture is. It's explained through culture like that. Yeah, we've been doing this for a long time, so there must be a reason for it. So we never challenge or we never question this kind of practices. So this is the first thing usually get students to think about the experiences. So I just want to share with you, when we want to understand discrimination, we can refer to this Article 1 in CEDAW that defined discrimination against women as any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women, irrespective of their marital status, on the basis of the equality of men and women, human rights and fundamental freedom in political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. So when we said exclusion, the experience, the women are excluded. They're not allowed to go to the holy places. They're restricted, made on the basis of sex, that they are women. And that has the effect or the purpose of basically impairing the recognition or enjoyment or exercise of their rights on the basis of the equality with men. So here, the keyword here, it has the effect or the purpose. So what it means that there are two types of discrimination: direct discrimination, that if the law directly discriminates on the basis of sex, women being excluded, not able to take inheritance. So that's a direct discrimination. So for the purpose of basically limiting the enjoyment of rights of women. Women are not able to inherit. Even the case of women are not allowed to enter the holy places, it's also a direct discrimination. I'm not sure if it's written in the law or anything, but in practice, it says that you are not allowed. It has the prohibition probably somewhere written in the temple areas that you cannot enter, right? So that also constitutes direct discrimination. But some other things that might have the effect of limiting the rights of women although it's not directly says that women are not allowed to do this, but in practice, it might lead to that effect. We call that indirect discrimination. Maybe we could look at some example, but first, to understand what do we mean by distinction, exclusion, or restriction, and why are there distinctions, exclusion, and restrictions on women. And here, just to share with you the differences between sex and gender, and this is very basic. And interestingly, I found this infographic from the Lancet, which is a medical journal, a very famous medical journal that has this infographic to explain the differences between sex and gender. Female sex is biological, right? And what is the biology of male and female, the differences. But gender here is understood as something culturally and socially defined. So we need to understand that as women, certain roles and responsibility are expected of us. And as men as well, certain roles and responsibility are expected of men. Certain attributes or qualities that are expected of men and women differently. And then leads to the entitlements of what they are entitled to based on their roles, responsibilities, and the qualities. Then these rights, enjoyment of rights are different between men and women. So we know that women are expected to have roles as caring and doing service jobs because they are more sensitive, they are more caring, so they are fitting to do that kind of jobs. But when women are expected to do that kind of roles, automatically the opportunities for their jobs also become restricted, right? They're expected to do this caring work, taking care of home, and it's become non-paid. It's not even recognized as economically income generating. They don't get compensated for that. So as a result, women do not seem to be needing a lot of support, so maybe they don't have to inherit anything. They don't need that. So in terms of entitlement, they are inferior to men, and they are dependent on men who, on the other hand, are expected to be leaders and do all kinds of things that breadwinner, earning income. And so they're supposed to have higher respect and are given more support to recognitions in the society. Therefore, maybe they are given greater economic power through inheritance and also social status, through religious practices and all that. So here the differences between sex and gender is very important, and we need to understand the gender construction that is resulting in the gender-based discrimination. Gender ideology determines what is expected of us, what is allowed of us, and what is valued of us. And that's resulting in discrimination, inequality, distribution of resources, access to and enjoyment of rights. Even though in Article 1, the definition of discrimination is sex-based discrimination, but if we interpret Article 1 together with Article 2F and 5A, which is it's about the cultural practices that needs and stereotype that needs to be changed. It the convention then covers gender-based discrimination against women. And this is the interpretation in the general recommendation of CEDAW committee that explained further about the convention itself. It explained that the term gender refers to socially constructed identities, attributes, and roles of women and men, and society's social and cultural meanings for those biological differences. And this results in hierarchical relationship between women and men in the distribution of power and rights, favoring men and disadvantaging women. So this is exactly what we are experiencing on why we see certain stereotypes and certain exclusion restrictions on what women can do or cannot do. I was talking about direct and indirect discrimination. And here again, the general recommendation, a general comment of CEDAW explained further that direct discrimination constitutes different treatment explicitly based on the grounds of sex and gender differences. And you can see this in the laws and policies that stipulate different kind of treatment. So the examples around inheritance and women accessing or not be able to access certain places consider direct discrimination. And indirect discrimination happens when law, policy, or program does not appear to be discriminatory on its face, but has a discriminatory effect when implemented. When the law doesn't say women are not allowed to do certain things, but in practice, it causes disadvantage for women. The women are, at the end of it, are excluded from certain opportunities. Some workplaces require staff to work on the weekends, for example. And when women have the role of caring, taking care of family, taking care of their parents, taking care of the children, they have to do housework. The weekends are actually the prime time to do all this kind of thing. And women do not necessarily get promoted to a higher position in the workplace because maybe the bosses see that, okay, women cannot devote their time enough to, to the work, to the job that they are required to do, to work in the evenings or on the weekends. But of course, there is nothing that says that, yes, we don't want women to do this. We want everyone to do it, but somehow women cannot become leaders or, get promoted because of this kind of expectations in the workplace. So it could constitute indirect discrimination. It's not specifically that only men would discriminate against women or men would not promote gender equality, but the ideology of gender is prevalent for both men and women. Even women ourselves discriminate against women. So that ideology is for both men and women, that women can discriminate against women as well, and men can also be championed for gender equality. But that's kind of attitude and mindset and understanding of this gender ideology that we want to address for both men and women.
Just to add in also about about CEDAW and discrimination, mostly focusing on women. I think we should also not forget that we need to look at CEDAW as, it actually enforces that discrimination against all genders. In fact, some of the policies, in other places, we may be focusing rightly or wrongly too much on women that we forget to be gender neutral. An example of that would be like when you talk about sexual harassment, the law it really talks about sexual harassment against women. So it is here that you are actually, you will end up discriminating the men who would be the boys and men who will be involved in sexual harassment. So this is why when you talk about human rights and gender, to an effect, we are discriminating the boys and the men if especially they have been victims of sexual and gender-based violence. So that tells us also that in our societies, while it is true that many of our societies have strong patriarchal values, but that patriarchal values in return also discriminate boys and men not to come forward and to tell the society if they are victims of sexual and gender-based violence.
I think this is a very important point that, when CEDAW was adopted in 1979, there was an issue of between the two sexes, right, and females. So this focused really on discrimination against women. But when we understand the concept of discrimination, gender-based discrimination, I think it's important that we need to expand the parameter to include everybody. So in terms of whoever that suffer from discrimination based on the basis of sex or gender or other identities, that they should also be able to make use of the treaties like this to expand the interpretation and make the national domestic laws that would be able to recognize the violence against just different identities. So I agree with that. And the fact that boys men also suffer from this patriarchal ideology. They keep to themselves, when they are harassed. They're supposed to be strong, right? And it's even more, let's say, shameful for men to come out and say that they have been harassed. There have been movies on this as well. I show this movie to students, The Hunting Ground. It's about sexual harassment in the United States, and something that's not talked much about. It's in universities, on university campuses, and the studies show that actually men are harassed and they are not coming out to speak, and because of this gender ideology. So yeah, we definitely need to expand our understanding of gender-based discrimination. But the point here is to understand the idea of discrimination. You can ask students, for example, of laws or policies or practices in your countries that consider as positive or negative for gender equality, right? So when we talk about equality or non-violence in the society, what kind of laws that enable that kind of equality, and what laws or policies or practices that are still hindrance to the achievement of gender equality in the society. But here I would like to just focus a little bit on now moving from non-discrimination to the concept of equality. What kind of equality do we want? I mean, not just women. Now, I think we can even open this up to everyone and say, what do we want as equality? And maybe we can use this case study as a sample for discussion. I use this with the students, but if you have other case studies to share, that would be useful as well. But let's try to work on this together when we are on site and we have a large number of students. You can ask students to work on this case study in groups, and they can come and share their responses. So in a prison in the city of Kanpur, 20% of dangerous sex offenders were scattered throughout the dormitories of the prison. Because of the absence of adequate facilities, the prisoners were not classified or segregated according to their offense or level of dangerousness. Consequently, the prison authorities issue a regulation providing that women warders would do desk jobs, prohibiting them from direct contact with the prisoners. And now the women warders challenged this regulation in the court. So they bring this case to the court. And the court upheld the regulation. So basically the court made the decision that the regulation should be enforced, and giving and explaining that because the situation in the prison is so volatile, there would be greater vulnerability of women to sexual attack. So this justified the exclusion of women from being the warders and working in the position that would have direct contact with the prisoners. And this decision was made by the court despite of the fact that the prisoners in question themselves had previously filed a successful lawsuit on the ground that violent and chaotic condition of the prison were themselves illegal. Okay, so that's the case. And now in the prison, women warders are not allowed to do the contact position with prisoners. So the job is not to patrol in the prison, but they're assigned to desk jobs. And they protest against this regulation in the court. But the court upheld this regulation, saying that women are vulnerable, so they are then in danger to be attacked by the prisoners. The question here is that, do you agree or disagree with the court? You have to give your reason in terms of its implications for women. In case of disagreement, please also give other opinions for the way in which the court could have ruled. An option you can also do, put the students into smaller groups, and it would be easier for them to discuss among themselves. When we talk about equality, does it mean that we want women to do whatever men are able to do? That's the first thing. So in this case, some people might say that, well, if women are able to do the job, let them do. If they're strong enough and they can protect themselves, let them do the job. So they can be equal. The other approach would be, yes, well, women are weaker, so let's protect them. So they are not able to do certain things, but in a short term, it might be seen as positive because they are protecting women. But in a long term, they might lose out on a lot of opportunities. The third option is to create enabling conditions for not just women, but also for whoever have to work in this dangerous situation to be able to do that job safely. That's kind of a different approach to equality if you take this case as example. Here, if you take the sameness approach of formal equality, you would perhaps disagree with the judge's decision that the judge will not allow women to do the patrolling position. You would say that yes, if women apply for the job of the warden, and they should be prepared to do the job under all conditions. And this approach sees men and women as the same and does not recognize the differences between men and women. Yes, we have biological difference, but also gender constructed difference. But here, the formal model of equality does not recognize any differences. So it applies single standard, and it's the male standard. So men can do this and women can do, but women have to prove themselves and women have to prepare to do the hard job, right, at whatever cost. So this is the kind of formal equality. What does it mean? It puts the burden on women to improve themselves. right? That if you want to be the leader, if you want to be the CEO, to be successful, you have to be able to do everything, compete in the male standard. So that's the formal, the sameness approach. Second approach is what the court was doing, is to apply this protectionist approach. So women voters should be protected because they are more vulnerable. The approach sees the difference and set out to treat women differently. That disadvantaged them in a short term or long term. And this difference is not challenged or addressed, and it perpetuates the difference and not doing anything to minimize or eradicate or compensates for that difference. And also here it assumes that only women are vulnerable. But actually anyone working in that kind of dangerous situation could be vulnerable. So men can also be attacked, right, by prisoners. And the prisons themselves, even they are men, they also can be attacked by one another, and that's why they filed complaint earlier that the situation in the prisons is so dangerous. And the last model of equality is the corrective, or we call it substantive approach to equality, which is promoted in the CEDAW. So this approach takes the view that the authorities have an obligation to put safety measures to make the jail safer for men and women workers. And it's a myth here to assume that only women are vulnerable to attack. And see the differences and address them so that women and men they may benefit equally. So this is the substantive model of equality. And when we talk about the kind of equality that we want, it's this substantive or corrective approach of equality that we want to be promoting. And so just to show you this picture, so instead of treating everyone the same, so these two pictures, the children want to see the baseball game. And people have differences, right? They're different size, different height. And if you treat them the same way, all of them cannot enjoy the rights, so they cannot see the game. But if you recognize the differences and provide enabling condition to those one who are disadvantaged by giving more boxes to the one that the boy is the shortest one. So all of them can see the games. If you want to add another picture here, is then you remove these fences so everyone can enjoy the game. So you remove the barriers to access to equality so that everyone can enjoy. We want to promote this substantive model of equality, which is being promoted by CEDAW, but it does not only restrict it to equality for women, but it's for everyone, right? Different identities, different sex, race, ethnicity. We can use this substantive equality concept to analyze the different laws, policy, and programs in our countries to see whether it promotes the substantive model of equality or not. Right? But basically, it's about creating the enabling conditions for different people. The principles of equality here is not just equality of opportunity, also equality of results. So at the end of the day, you want everyone to be able to enjoy their rights and equality as a legal standard in personal status. So that's actually the first step, is equality in the law. How do we promote this equality? It's through temporary measures, special measures, that something needs to be done to ensure that people who are at disadvantage from different status can enjoy the opportunities and result. When you look at the state publication, I suggest that you engage in critical readings of the text and also identify the gaps. Because when this treatise came out and was adopted in the first place, the situation was like 20, 30, 40 years ago. And the world has moved along, right? And there's a lot of things that have changed. And a lot of explanation, even the provision in the convention itself may not be adequate anymore. And that's why there are general recommendations, general comments that expand, elaborate on what are the new interpretations on these initial articles. But for CEDAW, I just want to highlight Article 4 and 5, which are important. Maybe you want to discuss this with the students, how to ensure non-discrimination and promote equality is around affirmative action, and also to address social and cultural patterns, right? And again, we were talking about patriarchy, male-dominated culture, but this ideology have impact on not just women, but also on men and other genders. So we need to understand this as well. And here are some of the general recommendations that have come out, and this is not exhaustive. So you can read more on the recommendations on CEDAW, and just some of the challenges to CEDAW that have came out. You can also point this out and discuss. So violence against women, a number of us have talked about this issue. Initially, it was not very clearly identified within CEDAW, but violence against women became an issue and picked up by CEDAW in the general recommendations. Later, 2 decades later after the adoption the first time, so General Comments 19 in 1992, but also in 2017, this gender-based violence general recommendation, which is updating the general recommendation 19, so you can read more about this. Some comments around CEDAW are not being very explicit about reproductive health, especially looking at artificial contraception and abortion rights for women. And also here a failure to address issue of sexual orientation. But here is how then do we creatively interpret and trying to make use of CEDAW and some of the concepts and principles that enshrined in this treaty to expand it and to make it address other issues around sexual orientation as well. So now when we talk about gender, it's more than just male and female gender. There's issues around sexuality, sexual preferences, that also come in. So it gets more complicated and it's more layered to it. But I think for the basic, if we are able to understand the key concepts around discrimination and equality, this could help us to start thinking of how we could integrate gender dimension into our teaching.